Testing, testing. Hello? Can you hear me? Awesome. So we're going to start at 6 o'clock. So right now, if you could open up to the PowerPoint that I posted on Google Classroom, that's what I'm going to use to run through the whole thing. And we're going to save questions until the end. But actually, if you guys have any questions right now that I can answer, I'll answer any questions now. But while I'm going through the whole thing, no questions. Otherwise, it'll be a mess.
The other guys in midterm has moved to Friday. Gradient? That's it. Fantastic. Oh, gosh. I'm going to me. I'll see you soon.
All right, it's 6 o'clock. Are you guys ready? Can you guys type into the chat? All right, I'm just going to get started. All right. And if there are any big issues, you can send me an email. Awesome. All right, let's get started. So let's start at the very beginning. So changes in demand and changes in quantity demanded. So we have two graphs over here, right? Both downward sloping demand curves. All right. This is the first slide on the review slideshow. And so as we can see, that when price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. But the most important thing to remember is that price doesn't shift the curve. All right. Price means we move along the curve. That's why we call all of our shifters non-price determinants of supply or demand. All right. So if we increase, for instance, the demand curve, what we're saying is at any given price, we have increased the quantity demanded that we want. All right. Here, that's not what we're saying. If we're changing the price, what we're saying is, ceteris paribus, everything else is staying the same. And all we want, if the price goes down, is more quantity demanded at that lower price, right? But if we decrease the demand, then we want less quantity demanded at every price, right? So here are these two graphs, and you absolutely need to differentiate when you're explaining, right? So if you say, right, the price goes down and demand goes up, from the test point of view, you're completely wrong, right? So what you're telling me is when the price goes down, we're shifting the curve. And you can't say that, right? When the price goes down, we're moving either along the supply or demand curve, but it doesn't shift. And as we see in a little bit, when we go over government intervention, this is very important, right? So one mistake we could make with price floors or price ceilings is to shift the curve when we don't shift the curve. All we do is move along the curve because those are just changes in price. So the second slide shows us the non-price determinants of demand. right? These are very important for you to know. You don't need to know all of them, but you should know some of them really well and have examples for them. Right? So the first one is tastes and preferences. Right? So recently there was a new study that came out that said red meat wasn't as bad for you as we originally thought. Right? So the demand for red meat increased. Right? So we could show that by going from here and shifting the demand curve to the right. Right? Or, I hope I'm not confusing anyone by adding a supply curve. Right? If we increase the demand at the original price, the quantity demanded will be greater than quantity supplied, and that will cause a shortage. How do we solve shortages? We raise the price, and the price will go up until we meet a new equilibrium point. All right? So that's what happened with red meat, right? Tastes and preferences changed, demand increased, there was a shortage at the original price, the price went up, that higher price sent a signal and an incentive to all of the suppliers, hey, we need more of this, right? And that's what happened, right? So that's a positive change in tastes and preferences. A negative change in tastes and preferences is, I don't know, if coffee causes cancer, or if there's some negative medical effect, right? Or if just something's not popular anymore, like fidget spinners, right? Fidget spinners aren't popular anymore, so the demand for fidget spinners went down. Right? Other related goods prices. These are two separate shifters. One is substitute, one is complement, all right? A good thing for substitutes would be Coke and Pepsi. So if the price for Coke goes up, then the demand for Pepsi is going to go up, because when people go into a store, they're going to substitute away from the more expensive good to buy the other good. All right. Complements are two things that go together. So gasoline and a car. So if the price of gasoline goes up, then the demand for cars are going to go down, right? So lots of different examples of this. You should have one for each ready for tomorrow. So expectations is the idea that we want to buy at the lowest price. And if we think the price is going to go higher in the future, then we're going to buy more today. And if we think the price is going lower in the future, we're going to buy less today. All right. So it's just thinking, where do we think the future price is going to be? And we just want to buy it at the lowest price, whenever that may be. All right. Next is incomes. So incomes are interesting. It depends on whether it's a normal or inferior good. All right. A normal good is a good that when income increases, demand also increases. All right. So if your incomes go up, going out to eat will become they will increase the demand for that, because that's a normal good. All right. But there are inferior goods. There are certain types of cereal brands that are inferior, that people don't like as much, but they buy them because they're maybe cheaper, right? Or maybe ramen noodles would be a good example of an inferior good. So if your income goes up, demand for ramen noodles is going to go down. All right. So just be careful with that non-price determinant. And if income goes up and demand goes up, just make sure that it's a normal good. And last one, probably the most straightforward, is size of the market. So the more consumers, the more demand. All right. So if more people move to a neighborhood, then demand for goods and services are going to increase. So those are non-price determinants. Like I said, you don't need to know all of them perfectly, but you really should know a couple of them very well and have examples. All right. And then on the next two slides are other examples that you should take a look at if you needed more examples. All right. So that is demand. You also, it's not on one of these slides, you should know the law of demand, which is ceteris paribus, all else being equal. When the price of a good falls, people will buy more, so the quantity demanded will increase. And as the price of a good increases, ceteris paribus, all else being equal, people will buy less of it, quantity demanded will fall. Right? So now we should be on the law of supply slide. And what this is showing is that supply is upward sloping. The law of supply states that, ceteris paribus, as price increases, quantity supplied will increase, right? There are a few different ways we could explain why this is, but the simplest, most straightforward way is as the price increases, that increases the revenue and therefore the profit that firms can make by selling the good, right? So, and also as we increase the supply of a good, we have something called diminishing marginal returns, which means it's harder to produce more of the good, costs go up, and in order to compensate for higher costs, we have higher prices. So here are non-price determinants of supply. Again, price doesn't shift the curve. That's why it's non-price determinants of supply. All right. So first and possibly most importantly are subsidies and taxes. All right. So a subsidy is giving money, is the government giving money to a company to lower their cost of production. Right? The reason to do this might be because they want to lower the price for consumers, because when you increase supply, the price falls. Hold on, let me grab that. So, supply and demand, right? When you increase the supply, so at the original price, quantity supplied has now increased. Quantity demanded has stayed the same at the original price after we shifted the supply curve. And what that does is it creates a temporary surplus. That surplus is the reason why the price falls to a new equilibrium point. All right. And so there are a couple of reasons why we want to do this. You guys will normally look at subsidies as a way for the government to solve positive externalities by increasing either consumption or production. But here we can lower the price or increase the quantity of a good. Either one of those might be a reason why the government might want to subsidize a good, right? We might want to lower the price of a good to make it more affordable for consumers, or for some reason we might want to increase its quantity. Taxes are the exact opposite, right? It's firms are paying the government money, right? And what this does is it increases the cost of production and it shifts supply to the left, right? Higher prices, right? So the reason why we might want to do this is either we want to discourage a good like cigarettes, or the government might need money. So the government needs to tax something. So it might just have to tax this good, right? If there's one thing we want to tax things that are inelastic and negative externalities, but we're going to get there in a minute, right? Just let that seep in. Those are the things we want to tax, right? Technology is basically a way to do things more efficiently, more productively. It lowers the cost of production. When we do that, we shift supply to the right. There will never be an example of like a negative technology shock, right? So technology will only increase supply. We're never going to decrease supply. Other related goods prices. So here what that means is imagine you have an oil rig and you can either produce oil or natural gas, right? If the price of oil goes up, then you're going to be supplying less natural gas because you're going to shift those rigs over to the industry that can make you more money, right? So that's the idea of other related goods prices, right? You can think about that very easily in a labor market, right? If one industry is paying higher prices or higher wages, then more people will go into that industry and there will be a reduction of supply of labor in other industries. Next is resource costs. The most straightforward resource costs are usually going to be things like oil or labor. And whenever resource costs increase, that just means the cost of production increases. Whenever the cost of production increases, we shift supply to the left. All right. Good example of this is recent attacks in the Middle East that have increased the price of oil. That would be a good example of an oil shock. And the states around the country that are implementing or have already implemented increased minimum wages, that's going to drive up wages. That's going to drive up production costs. Right? And the last one is expectations of producers. This one is definitely less important than the other ones. But if we expect prices to be higher in the future, then we might decrease production now. And if we think they're going to fall in the future, to increase supply now. Honestly, expectations of producers, you don't really need to know that. All right, great. And now, again, very important, price doesn't shift the curve, right? So if we increase the price, then the quantity supplied increases, but supply doesn't increase, right? So our example of red meat, if we increase demand, price goes up, quantity goes up, but supply didn't change. Quantity supply changed, right? Like in here, supply, if we're increasing supply, what we mean is that at every single price, the quantity supplied increases, right? So that's just the difference. Again, please remember, price does not shift the curve. And again, you need to know 2 or 3 non-price determinants really well with examples. All right, so then if we put the 2 together, we have a market equilibrium. That's where supply meets demand. And assuming that it's a normal good without any spillovers, that's not an externality, this is going to be allocatively efficient. Right? So what would happen if we raise the price to $3? Well, in this example, right? So if we raise the price above the equilibrium price, then we move along both of our curves. So that means quantity supplied increases, quantity demanded decreases, and now what we have is what's called a disequilibrium, because now quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and this is unsustainable, right? So basically, at the end of the day, the owner doesn't want to have extra supply. He's not maximizing his revenue by doing this. So what he's going to do is he's going to lower his price, and the market, without anybody telling it to do this, is going to push the price towards equilibrium. And that's naturally going to happen, right? On the flip side, on the other point of view, if we lowered the price before equilibrium, then more people would want to buy it. The quantity supplied would fall because now they wouldn't want to sell as much of it. They wouldn't make as much money. And instead of a surplus, here we're going to have a shortage. So people are going to be running out of the good. And what they're going to do is they're going to bid up the price, right? If there's like 1 loaf left at the end and there's 5 people who want it, the price of that loaf is going to rise, right? So that's what we're talking about. When the price is below equilibrium, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, creates a shortage, and the way we solve shortages is by raising the price until it gets back to equilibrium. Again, this happens automatically. All right, great. Here, it's good to recall that demand is marginal social benefit and supply is marginal social cost. These are very important terms for you to know. All right, so let me just read them quickly. MSB, the demand for any good, represents the benefits that society derives from the consumption of that good. Marginal benefits decrease at higher levels of output because additional units of a good bring benefits to fewer and fewer people the more of the good that exists. So what that means is, what we have is diminishing marginal utility. As we have more of it, the benefits go down. That's why MSB is downward sloping. But just remember that the demand curve is the MSB curve. And supply is the MSC curve, which is as we're producing more of something, it gets harder to produce. As something gets harder to produce, its marginal costs increase. And as costs increase, prices have to increase to compensate producers in order to produce, right? So generally, you should just see a supply curve as a reflection of what the underlying costs are. So if costs are going up, then supply shifts to the left, and if costs are going down, supply is going to shift to the right. Okay? So that's MSB and MSC, and as I've repeated 1,000 times, we want to produce where MSC equals MSB. That is allocatively efficient. right? What that means is we're producing where society wants us to produce. And as we're going to see in a minute, if we're not producing where MSC equals MSB, then we're going to have a deadweight loss, and society is not going to be where it wants to be, right? We're at a what's called suboptimal level, all right? Great. So here, at a price of $2, MSC equals MSB, and we would have allocative efficiency. All right, allocative efficiency, where MSC equals MSB, right? Assuming that there's no hidden cost, what that's saying is assuming that there's no production or consumption externalities. All right. Here, the next part we absolutely need to know, which is consumer and producer surplus. So consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they have to pay. That definition is extremely important. Next, producer surplus, that's the difference between what producers are willing to sell for and what they have to sell it for. Right? What we're trying to do is to maximize community surplus, which is consumer plus producer surplus together. Right? That's the goal. Right? And what we see is whenever we have deadweight loss, that means we're not maximizing our surplus. That's what the inefficiency means, right? That if we had done something right or fixed the deadweight loss, then there would be more surplus for the society. All right, so that's what we mean by total welfare, maximizing surplus. Right? Now, where do we put consumer and producer surplus? Well, on the next slide, you can see that the demand curve represents what consumers are willing and able to pay for a good, right? And this is the equilibrium price. Well, the definition of consumer surplus is the difference between what we're willing and able to pay and what we pay. So what we're willing and able to pay is the demand curve, and what we actually pay is the equilibrium price, right? So it's always going to be that difference, right? And as you're going to see, as the price falls, consumer surplus increases, and as the price increases, producer surplus will increase. So here, you can see producer surplus as the difference between the supply curve and the equilibrium price. That's because that's the difference between what they're willing and able to sell something for and the price, right? Again, at allocative efficiency, we have maximized total surplus, right? Great. All right, so now, elasticity, right? Actually, great, elasticities, right? So first of all, by far the most important is PED, all right? So PED is price elasticity of demand, or how responsive consumers are to a change in price. What we're saying is, for every 1% increase in price, how much of a percent change in quantity demanded is there? So we're not shifting any curve. We're just thinking, what is the slope of the curve? So if for every 1% change in price, there is a smaller change in quantity demanded, then we would have a very steep or inelastic demand curve. If for every 1% change in price, the quantity demanded changed by more than 1%, then we would have a flatter demand curve, and it would be responsive. All right, that's really important. That's where we're headed. Cross price elasticity of demand and income elasticity of demand we're going to talk briefly about, and price elasticity of supply is how responsive producers are to a change in price. All right, so here's the equation. You absolutely need to know it. So it's percent change in quantity demanded over percent change in price. So you're going to need to make up numbers that make sense so that you can spit out a PED that correlates with the elasticity of your good. Right? So here's an example. If you scroll through the PowerPoints I've given you, there are tons of examples. What I need is the correct PED coefficient when you give me an example. For instance,
Cigarettes, right? That is like a go-to inelastic good, right? Inelastic demand. That means the PED must be less than 1, all right? So if you tell me it's 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, all of those are good numbers, all right? If you tell me it's greater than 1, that's not good. And if you tell me it's 0, that's also not good. The reason is if the PED is 0, then there's no change in quantity demanded. So we could raise the price of cigarettes to $1 million a pack, and the quantity demanded will stay exactly the same. That's not reality. That's not how that works. All right. So it needs to be something in the middle. So here's our equation. All right. I need you to remember these numbers. All right. The key ones to remember, if you just remember 2 of these, remember that a PED of greater than 1 is elastic, meaning it's responsive, meaning that for every 1% change in price, there is a greater than 1% change in quantity demanded, and inelastic, which is a PED less than 1. So for every 1% change in price, there is a less than 1% change in quantity demanded. The biggest mistake that people have been making this year is for inelastic goods, telling me that when the price increases, quantity doesn't change. That's not the case, right? When price increases, quantity demanded falls, but by less than the change in price, right? That's what it means to be non-responsive or just inelastic, all right? All right, and so here are the examples. So use these examples. A great go-to example of something that's highly elastic is eating out to eat, because that's just a luxury good. You don't need to do it. Or like long-run international travel, right? That is the definition of a luxury good that is highly expensive, right? And on the other side, gasoline and cigarettes tend to be our go-to inelastic things to know, right? So what do you need to know for elasticity, or specifically PED? You need to know splat, all right? So the number of substitutes we have, the more elastic the demand curve is going to be. And again, what we mean by elastic is flatter, and what we mean by inelastic, the steeper, right? So the more substitutes we have, the flatter the demand curve is going to be, the more responsive it's going to be. Just think about it like this. Imagine that there's one restaurant in a city, right? So they have a captive audience. Their demand curve is relatively inelastic. If people want to go out to eat, they have to go out to eat there, right? So they've basically captured this market of going out to eat, right? Now, another restaurant has opened up, right? Now there's competition. Now people are competing based on price and quality and other things. So now the demand curve of the original restaurant would be flatter. If they're keeping their price high, people are going to substitute over to the other one, right? So their demand curve became more elastic, right? That's what we mean by introducing substitutes. That means there's more competition and people are focusing more on price, right? The next one is proportion of income. So people tend to focus very carefully on things that are expensive. Cars, houses, any good that just like people deem to be expensive in their ordinary lives as a proportion of their income, right? That makes expensive goods elastic. People are responsive to changes in price for very expensive goods. Cheap goods, people are not very responsive for changes in prices, right? So an example of that would be toothpicks. Toothpicks are unbelievably cheap, right? And if they increased in price 20%, most people wouldn't notice. The quantity demand would not fall very much. And because of that, we know that a good is inelastic. Next is luxury versus necessity. Things that you absolutely need are necessities, and so you're willing to sort of pay whatever it takes to get those things. Things that are luxuries have a flatter demand curve, and if the price makes sense, you'll buy it, but a lot of times, like No, it's a luxury. I don't need to have this good. So the demand curve is going to be flatter. Addictive, this is a very, well, actually, they're all very important, right? But here, the more addicted you are to a good, right, the more inelastic your demand curve will be, right? So, like, there's stories from like the 80s and 90s where like drug dealers would give people their first taste of a drug, right, for free. They'd be like, here, on the house, right? Why would they do that? To get them addicted so that the demand curve would be more inelastic, all right? Another way to think about this might be for cigarettes, right? If someone in high school starts smoking, their demand for cigarettes might not be that inelastic. For one thing, they're expensive, and for another, they might not be completely addicted yet. But over time, 10, 20 years, as you're fully addicted and you view it as a necessity, it'll be more inelastic, all right? So in that case, a good could have different elasticities for different types of consumers. And the last one is time. This is going to be very important when we look at short run versus long run of government intervention, all right? Over time, both supply and demand become more elastic. The reason for that is because as consumers and producers have more time to adjust, they can change the underlying realities. So let me give you two examples, right? One is, imagine you have a flat tire on the highway, right? Your demand for a new tire is extremely inelastic. You just want to get on your way. You'll pay $100, $150 for a tire right then and there. But let's say you had more time to shop, right? Let's say you weren't in a rush and you could go on Amazon and you could go to a bunch of different sites and you could compare prices. If you have more time, your demand is going to be more elastic. You're going to be more responsive to price. But in the short run, you weren't because you just needed to get it done, right? Another example on the supply side would be, let's say you own a mine, right? Tin, right? So you produce tin and the demand for tin skyrockets, right? Great, prices are going up. But there's not very much you could do in the short run. You can maybe have some miners go in and like do a little extra mining at night, but the PES for mining is very low in the short run. If you think demand is going to be high for a sustained period of time, what you'll do is you'll eventually open a new mine, right? And that new mine will increase your capacity and will make your supply curve flatter. So as demand increases, you can increase production, and as demand decreases, you could scale it back, all right? But in both of those cases, the tire and the mine, you're really stuck in the short run. And like that's what inelastic means, right? Elastic means you have the luxury of looking at the price. Okay? All right, so why might we want to know PED? So businesses might want to know PED is if I have a highly elastic good, I can cut the price and increase total revenue, right? Because that's what elastic means. You can lower the price by 1%. Quantity demanded will increase by more than 1%. And since total revenue is price times quantity, you're going to increase total revenue. So whenever you see a restaurant offering a sale, whenever you literally see anybody offering a sale, you know that it's an elastic good, and they know that they're going to increase quantity demanded by a higher percentage than they're decreasing the price. Right? That's the main thing we'd want to know. Also, if we have an inelastic good where the demand is inelastic, well, maybe we'd want to raise the price, right? Like, why keep the price low for an inelastically demanded good, right? If you raise the price, then quantity demanded will fall by less than an increase in the price, right? Sorry, percent change in price, right? So your total revenue could go up if you have an inelastic good if you're raising the price. So these are two examples of businesses needing to know the PED for their products, right? The other example is government, right? Government needs to know, well, should we be taxing elastic or inelastic goods? And the simple answer I want to leave you with now, before we go on to the government intervention unit, is we want to tax inelastic goods. Because if we tax elastic goods, then the quantity is going to fall a lot. That's really going to hurt the industry. One thing that I want you to remember is that quantity equals employment. Right? So if we have a very elastic demand curve, here's our supply curve, right? Okay? So what that means is that the producer is not able to pass the increased price onto the consumer because they're responsive. And if they try to pass a lot of the tax onto the consumer, they're just not going to buy it because they're responsive. So in this case, the quantity is going to fall by a lot, which means the deadweight loss or the inefficiency is going to be quite large, right? That's going to be bad. Unemployment is going to be really high, and the government is not going to get a lot of tax revenue because, well, the quantity fell by so much, right? So if tax revenue is the amount of the per unit tax times the quantity, and if quantity falls off a cliff, then we're not collecting a lot of tax revenue, right? So we're destroying this industry and not collecting a lot of tax revenue. Really bad idea, right? We want to tax inelastic goods, goods with inelastic demand, because quantity demanded will not fall very much, and most of the tax is going to be passed on to the consumer because they're not responsive, meaning they don't care as much about the price, right? So we want, as a government, to tax inelastic goods to raise as much revenue as possible, right? But when we get to government intervention, this could be a limitation of taxing cigarettes because since they're so inelastic, if we tax them, great, we'll get a lot of revenue, but it's the quantity demanded might not fall very much, so it might not fix the problem of overconsumption. All right. So here is cross-price elasticity. So percentage change in the quantity of good A over percentage change in the quantity of good B. Somebody asked me, how do we know that a positive number is a substitute? Like, explain the math on that one. All right. So let's say we have Coke and we have Pepsi, right? Good A and good B. So if we increase the price of Coke by 5%, then some of those Coke buyers are going to jump ship and buy Pepsi. So the quantity demanded of Pepsi, let's say it goes up by 5%, right? The important thing here is that for substitutes, right, the change of price in one direction and the change in quantity is both going to be positive, right? So in that case, increase of 5%, increase of 5%, and so it's going to be a positive 1, right? So don't use those numbers for your cross-price elasticity for Coke and Pepsi, but that's how we know that if they're moving in the same direction, increasing price of one increases demand for the other, that's how we know they're substitutes. If, however, the price of gas increases, but the demand for cars falls, then they're moving in opposite directions, which means we're going to end up with a negative number, and a negative number means we have complements, right? So that's how we know it's substitutes and complements. And again, please remember, again, if it's greater than 1, it's elastic, meaning it's responsive, and if it's less than 1, it's inelastic. So what we're looking for cross-price elasticity of demand is both, is it responsive and is it a complementing substitute? You can have it any which way among them. All right. Income elasticity of demand. This should say YED. I think it's a mistake on the PowerPoint. Says percentage change in quantity over percentage change in income, right? So as we earn more money, right, as the percent change in income goes up, are we buying more or less goods, right? So assuming it's a normal good, as your income increases, your demand for goods are also going to increase, right? But if it's an inferior good, as your income increases, the demand for those goods goes down, right? And the reverse of that is, imagine the 2008 recession. We went into a major recession and sales at Walmart hit an all-time high because Walmart tends to be inferior goods, right? So during a recession, incomes fell and people bought more inferior goods and they bought less other types of goods that they might view as normal, right? But then as the economy recovered, they were spending more money on normal goods and less on inferior. Yeah, so that's what you need to know. And again, elastic or inelastic. All right. Lastly is PES. So for PES, other than the equation, right, what I'd really like for you to know, that's too far. Right. What I'd like for you to know is that in the shortest of short runs, the market period, supply is going to be extremely inelastic because producers are stuck. Right? They can't adjust their output however they want based on changes in demand. Right? You give them a little bit of time, the short run, right? Supply is more elastic, even though it might still be inelastic, because they're able to change things with their production. Right? In the very long run, they're able to totally change everything, and supply is much more elastic. So let me give you an example. So let's say demand for car companies increases, right? In the short run, there's not much we can do, right? Like the car companies can run overtime. Sure, they could do that, right? But that's not going to increase quantity very much. If you really want to increase quantity, you need a new plant. And a new plant takes time. So that's why time is the most important determinant for supply. And for this test, it's the only one you need to know, right? So just know that over time, supply is more elastic and it's flatter. Again, this is important for government intervention because when we look at shortages and surpluses and all of that stuff, because of price floors and price ceilings, in the long run, it's going to get worse because both supply and demand are going to get flatter, which is going to exacerbate whatever the issues are. Great. Give me 30 seconds, read the next few slides. All right. And again, if you guys have any questions, send me an email. I'll be checking my email. Not sure if the chat's working. All right. So next is government intervention. All right. So do we want to tax elastic or inelastic goods? Inelastic goods. Fantastic, right? Inelastic demand. But let's walk through how this works. Right? So here is a pencil market. Right? So the equilibrium price is 125. There's QE, right? Price and quantity. And so at $1.25, quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, and we are allocatively efficient. All right? And if you wanted to put consumer surplus, you would do the area of the demand curve down to 125 and over. And if you wanted to do producer surplus, you would do the supply curve up to 125 and over. All right? But the government, for whatever reason, wants to tax pencils. Pencils are a normal good. There's no externality involved, right? So what happens when you tax a good is you're increasing the cost of production, right? Here, we're talking about an indirect tax. So this is going to be what's called a per unit tax, as opposed to an ad valorem tax, which is a percent tax. So ad valorem taxes are going to look more like this, where supply goes much higher because as the price increases, the amount of the tax increases, right? But for the most part, we're talking about per unit taxes, which are constant over the number of goods, right? So here, we're taxing 50 cents. We shift supply to the left, but who's going to pay for this tax? That depends on elasticity. So what we can see here is that consumers are paying 30 cents more, and producers are getting 20 cents less, right? So what we see is the area between 155 and 105 is government revenue. So it's 50 cents times the quantity of the tax. That's government revenue. The difference between MSC and MSB is deadweight loss. What do I mean by MSC and MSB? I mean supply equals MSC, demand equals MSB, shifted supply to the left. So at this new one, at this new supply, right? This is MSB, this is MSC. So MSB is greater than MSC, which means we're under producing and consuming the good, right? So that's why the deadweight loss is there, right? So what else is going on here? Right? Key things to remember for a tax is stakeholders. So stakeholders are really good for evaluation if you need to evaluate a tax, right? So consumers are worse off, right? You can show that both because the price increased, but also because consumer surplus has shrunk, right? Producers are worse off because now the price for them is down and producer surplus has shrunk. Government benefits, as long as this is a normal good, society is worse off because we have deadweight loss, right? So that's the tax. On the next slide, you can see we really want to tax goods that are relatively inelastic for all the reasons that I said, and the burden of the tax is mostly going to fall on consumers. An extreme example, which you shouldn't use, is insulin. That demand is perfectly inelastic because you need insulin to live and it's cheap and like people really don't have a choice. So, sorry, just checking to see the battery. So in that case, demand would be perfectly inelastic. And here's supply. And then if we shifted supply to the left, quantity wouldn't change. That's the key here when we're thinking about, is it efficient or not, right? The more the quantity changes, the larger the deadweight loss, which means the more inefficient the policy is, right? That's a major reason why we want to tax inelastic goods, because the quantity won't change very much. And because the quantity won't change very much, government revenue will be high. Right? Great. And then on the next slide are our two graphs. So you should absolutely know these two graphs, right? What does elastic demand that is getting taxed look like versus inelastic demand? And we can see inelastic demand getting taxed. The amount of government revenue is much larger. The deadweight loss is much smaller. Quantity, and therefore employment, did not change very much versus the elastic good. All right? Great. And then the next slide just walks you through it. All right. Next is per unit subsidy. All right. So now what we're going to do is what we just did, but in reverse. So instead of the government taking money out of the market, it's putting money into the market. Right? So here, supply is going to shift to the right because the cost of production is lower. Because the cost of production is lower, supply shifts to the right, the price for the consumer goes down, but the price for the producer goes up. So I need you guys to practice that. I'm pretty sure this is one of the biggest mistakes people make with subsidies, is they don't put the price for the producer in the right place. All right? So if you draw a supply and demand, right, price, quantity, we shift supply to the right, Now, this is the price for the consumer. That's quantity one. Go up to the original supply curve. That's the price for the producer, right? That's how you need to do it. A lot of people are making mistakes and they're going like this and they're going down here. Now, at the new quantity, at quantity one, there should be two distinct prices, one for the producer and one for the consumer. The producer gets more money and the consumer pays less money, right? Now, what else is happening here, right? So, consumer and producer surplus are increasing, right? So if we're thinking stakeholders, right, then consumers and producers are both winners. But the big loser here is government. So the way we would show that is the difference between PP and PC is the per unit subsidy. And then we go over to Q1. This is the amount of the subsidy. That's the cost to the government. Well, as you can see, the cost to the government is greater than the increased consumer and producer surplus. That's one reason why we have deadweight loss, right? The cost is greater than the benefit. Another way to say that is that Q subsidy, MSC is greater than MSB. When MSC is greater than MSB, marginal social cost is greater than marginal social benefit. That means we're overproducing the good, the costs are exceeding the benefits, and we would be better off if we reduced quantity. So that's what we're saying here. So in both taxes and subsidies, there is a deadweight loss, but in different places, and just keep in mind the different stakeholders. All right, great. So now we are on price floors and price ceilings. Remember, price ceilings go under the equilibrium, assuming that they're effective, right? So price ceiling is the maximum price. Price floor is the minimum price. And there's a couple of go-to examples for price ceilings. One are necessary goods, usually after a hurricane, right? So after a natural disaster, demand for necessities increases, and maybe low-income people can't afford them. So the government might come in and give a price ceiling to help low-income people be able to afford necessities, right? That's the intention. Another reason might be a necessity like housing, right? So the prices of housing have been increasing pretty much in every major city around the world, right? So if the government wants to get a hold on that, they might use price ceilings. But we'll go through why that's bad in a second. Over here, price floors are minimum prices. And so the two main ways we would do this is on agricultural products or on wages, right? And we'll go through that right now. All right, so here's the effect of a price ceiling. All right, let's imagine, I don't know, sure, gasoline, rent control, any of those things. Right? What you're doing is you're pushing the price below equilibrium. You are not shifting any curves. What you're doing is you're moving along the curves. So quantity supplied goes down, quantity demanded goes up, and you have a shortage. This makes sense, right? Now more people want it than people are willing to sell it. And remember that in the long run, this only gets worse because as time factors in, things become more elastic. So they're going to be flatter, which means there's going to be a larger shortage. But let's take a look at the stakeholders, right? So it's easy to look at consumers and say that they're winners, but that's only half true. Only the consumers that are able to buy the good are winners. But because of the shortage, there are some consumers that want the good that can't get it. So some consumers win, some consumers lose. In general, consumer surplus increases. But what's interesting is that what's happening is we're going from using the price mechanism to allocate resources to going to a first come, first serve system, right? So normally, if we have a functioning price system and a functioning market, it's people who are willing and able to pay the greatest amount get the good or service. That is no longer the case because now the price system isn't fully operating because we have a set price that we can't go above. So now it's just the people that are lucky enough to get to the store first that get the good, right? So just keep that in mind. The producer absolutely loses here, right? So think of the landlord. Their total revenue went down. You could easily show total revenue falling on this graph because the area P to Q in the original equilibrium, that's their total revenue. And now their total revenue is price control to the new quantity supplied, which is much smaller. So landlords are making less money. You might say, oh, who cares? Landlords are making less money, but the consumers some of them are better off. But by doing this, we're reducing the incentive for supply, right? So now landlords don't have the incentive to invest in new buildings, right? Or to even keep the quality of their buildings up. So over time, this is going to erode the housing stock, right? That tends to be a bigger problem with rent control because rent control tends to be permanent in a lot of cities, and price controls after natural disasters tend to be temporary, right? But just keep that in mind, right? We want to maximize total surplus. And what the deadweight loss here indicates is that we're failing, right? We might have helped consumers, but society as a whole is worse off. You can still say, I like price controls. How can you do that? Well, we have different stakeholders. You don't need to weigh them equally in your evaluation. So you can say, look, I understand there's a shortage. I understand there's deadweight loss. I understand there's inefficiency. I understand this. And yet, I want to protect low-income people from being really, really hurt in a certain situation. Or I really want to increase diversity in really expensive housing markets like Manhattan. And I think price ceilings are the way to do it, even after we factor in all of the other things. That is absolutely fine, right? There's no normative conclusion you need to come to. You just need to argue the facts, right? The conclusion's all yours. Right? Next, the effects of a price floor, right? So here, it's interesting, depending upon whether it's an agricultural or a labor market, right? So let's start with an agricultural. So farmers have a lot of political power all over the place. And so in the United States, they have created price floors for their goods, which means that the prices of their products are artificially higher than they would be in a free market. Right? What that does is, well, it decreases quantity demanded, increases quantity supplied, and what should just happen if the government didn't do anything is it would create a surplus, and then the surplus would find its way onto the market and the price would fall. But of course, that's not what they're trying to do. So what they do is they buy it up. So here's supply, here's demand, here's the price floor. And so here's our deadweight loss, quantity supplied, quantity demanded, surplus. And what they do is the government comes in and increases demand, right? And so buys up all the surplus. Great for the farmers. But if you want to look at the amount of the cost to the government, you do the difference between QD and QS times the price floor. So this whole area is the cost to the government. This whole area is the cost to the government. This over here is increased producer surplus, but everything else over here is the cost exceeding the benefits. So from a societal point of view, this is hugely inefficient, but the farmers benefit 100%. So the farmers benefit, consumers lose, government loses, society loses. All right. Hold on. And let me just explain the difference with the minimum wage. All right. So the minimum wage is increasing the price of labor. Right? So here's supply and demand. And in this case, The demand is from businesses that would want to hire workers. Right? So here, when the price increases because we increase the minimum wage to $15, the quantity supplied increases. More people want to work when prices are higher. That makes sense. But businesses want to hire them less. All right? So quantity demanded falls, and the difference between them is a surplus, otherwise known as unemployment. Right? Now, we should say that it's not going to be as bad in the short run because businesses are used to running a certain way. They're not going to know how to adapt right away. But in the long run, absolutely what's going to happen is you're going to see increased automation. So you're going to see the substitution of capital for labor. When that happens, you're going to see probably either more people unemployed or hopefully, possibly, if we increase the productivity of workers, maybe the demand for workers could increase. That's possible, right? But yeah, who wins and who loses? The winners are the people who get the higher wage and get to keep their jobs, right? The losers are the people who get fired and the people that have to pay higher prices for labor, right? And if we take this one step further, since labor is an input into so many businesses, that by increasing the wages, we're increasing the cost of production on a ton of businesses, which are going to raise prices for the consumers generally, right? And society is worse off, all right? Again, unemployment gets worse in the long run because both supply and demand become more elastic in the long run, all right? All right, so next is externalities. I'm going to check my email to see if you guys asked any questions, and I'll be right back. All right, so externalities. So basically what we're talking about with externalities is spillover costs or benefits to third parties, people who are not part of a transaction, right? So before, when we just did market equilibrium, we assumed that the seller and the buyer made a deal and that deal did not affect anybody else. Now we're flipping it and we're assuming that a market transaction has effects on third parties, whether positive or negative, right? That's what an externality is, right? So here are some examples. A good go-to for positive, actually, let me go through it one by one, but here are some examples, all right? So negative externalities of production has to do with pollution, right? So here, one thing to definitely remember is that the supply curve is always the MPC or the private cost for the producer, and the demand curve is always the private benefit. The way to think about that is if you're a firm, you don't care about external costs or benefits. And if you're an individual, you probably don't care about external costs or benefits, right? They exist, but when you make your own calculations, you only care about your own private costs, your own private benefits, right? But society cares about social costs and social benefits, and therefore might want to change our behavior to get to the correct allocation, right? So here we see MPC and supply, and here we see marginal social cost. So the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal private cost. The distance or the gap, which you should label, represents external costs. So somebody does like laundry, right? And by doing the laundry, they incur $5 of private costs, right? That's what it costs for the chemicals and the labor and all of that stuff and overhead, right? $5. And then when they're done, they dump a bunch of chemicals into the sewer, right? Which causes lots of problems later on for society. Let's put those external costs at $2. That means our total costs for society are 7, right? So our social costs are greater than the private costs. Right? So here, if we were to draw this out, this is y equals marginal private cost, social cost, marginal private benefit. Again, you're always going to have 3 curves when you start out. Right? So you should start out like this. Then the free market or the equilibrium is where supply meets demand. So this is price equilibrium, quantity equilibrium, P and Q. Right? Where do we want to produce? Where MSC equals MSB. All right, so here's MSC, here's MSB, and that's over here. So price, socially optimal, quantity, socially optimal. So what we're saying here is, because this firm is not internalizing, isn't feeling these external costs, they are overproducing. Or another way to think about it, from a society point of view, is they have an artificially low cost of production because they're not thinking about the cost to everybody else, right? That's not good from a society point of view. So how do we find deadweight loss, right? So we go to the quantity at the free market and we find the gap between MSC and MSB and we shade it in. Again, go to the quantity at the equilibrium or the quantity free market and you find the gap between MSC and MSB. Here, because it's a negative externality, it means we are overproducing the good, again, because of artificially low production costs, right? And here's yeah. And so the government is going to want to try to reduce this. So here, MSC is greater than MSB. That is why we have deadweight loss. Again, deadweight loss is inefficiency, right? So in a free market, this will exist. So when we think about on a spectrum, right, things that free markets are good at, things that government are good at, free markets are not great at solving this on their own, right? There are a bunch of ways that we can help markets solve this, but literally left to its own devices, that person doing that dry cleaning is going to dump the chemicals in the sewer because it's the goal of producers to maximize profit and to produce at the lowest cost of production. So unless we put certain like baseline regulations in place or unless we create a certain framework, they're going to produce at the lowest cost of production, and that might be bad for society. All right. Here is a cigarette market, right? If we were drawing this again, we might want the demand curve to be steeper because it's inelastic, but this is fine, right? And so here, the private benefit is greater than the social benefit. So here the example is smoking around other people creates secondhand smoke, right? Which can hurt everyone around you, right? So the difference between the private benefit and the social benefit in this case is the external cost. So let's say the private benefit is $5. The external cost is $2. So then the social benefit is $3, right? So again, here we're over consuming the good, right? Because the person is not factoring in the external costs when they're making their decisions, right? That's a problem. And again, how do we find deadweight loss? We go to the quantity at the free market and we find the difference between MSC and MSB, right? And I highly recommend that you go over how to find the deadweight loss. That is the thing that people get the most wrong on externality graphs. right? So again, over allocation into the cigarette market. All right. So how could we correct this? This is where the evaluation comes in. Right? You really should know 2, maybe 3 different solutions and like play them off of each other. Right? So what could we do? We could do taxes. Right? For the cigarette example we gave, taxes are great because the government's going to generate a lot of revenue, and it's not going to. But the problem is because quantity demanded doesn't change very much, it might not fully close the deadweight loss. So that could be a limitation of only using taxes. But governments love to do that because it generates lots of revenue. Right? But if we're going to tax, we're shifting supply to the left, which means higher prices for consumers and lower prices received by producers. Right? So consumers pay more, producers get less. Both of them are unhappy with that change, even if deadweight loss is going to be smaller. Regulation. All right, so we could do certain things to try to regulate these types of things. We could try to say you can't smoke around other people. New York City, their public parks, you're not allowed to smoke in public parks. The idea there is to reduce secondhand smoke. All right. Banning, so the problem with banning is unless it's a terrible thing, right? Some things are, murder, that should be banned, right? But here, for most goods, the socially optimal is not 0. And banning means 0, right? That could be an issue. Maybe we would have deadweight loss on the other side, right? Also, if you ban a good and there's still demand for it, that could create black markets, right? And black markets create their own problems, right? Also, if we ban a good, we don't get any taxes from it, right? So it's really interesting. For instance, Muslim countries around the world, right? So alcohol, not viewed very well within Muslim religion, but how different countries have addressed it. Some countries have banned it, and they've had black markets. And other countries have taxed it heavily to discourage its use, but then also they're collecting government revenue and preventing a black market from developing, right? And lastly is tradable permits. So this is the idea that we could basically sell the right to pollute. I'll get to that graph in 1 minute. All right. And then here are some examples, right? Again, when we think about MSC equals MSB, we only care about getting the quantity right. We don't care about getting the price right? So when you think about shifting this in, let's think about the cigarette market, right? So negative advertising would be a good one, right? But it lowers the price, right? Demand falls. Isn't that bad? Don't worry about it, all right? All we care about is getting the socially optimal quantity, right? Awesome. And while we're on cigarettes, the advertising example decreases demand because of tastes and preferences, changing tastes and preferences, but it usually takes a long time. So in the short run, it's not very effective. It's more effective in the long run. And it costs government money, which is an opportunity cost. Okay. And then here, this is what I just said, higher costs for producers, higher prices for consumers. If quantity falls, then employment falls, right? So an industry might not like that very much. And then the last one is loss of competitiveness in a global market. So for instance, some states are leading the way on climate change, right? Or doing things that are environmentally friendly. They're taxing heavily polluting industries, right? To try to be more environmentally aware, get closer to the socially optimal point, right? But then other states that don't have a lower cost of production, right? So like if one country or one place does something that raises the cost of production, they are at a disadvantage to the other places that haven't, right? So this is like one major thing to keep in mind, that like for something to truly be effective and not have adverse effects on maybe a particular industry, maybe need to be a coordination. All right. So here are tradable permits. So the idea is that we set the supply of tradable permits at a certain number, and we sell the permits. So we're selling the right to pollute, and we establish a demand for them. So companies need to buy them in order to pollute. And we started out at a very low price. So there'll be tons of permits so that the price will be low. And we're just like phasing them in over time. So then over time, we decrease the supply of permits. And assuming that there's economic growth, the demand for permits increases because as there's more economic activity, there's more of a demand to pollute, right? As this happens, the price for permits increases. And what that does is it raises the cost to pollute. So it raises the cost of production for polluters. And it's incentivizing people to be cleaner because not only if they're cleaner will it lower their cost of production, they could sell these permits to other firms. So it creates the incentives to be more environmentally sound, right? So this is basically creating a price for pollution. So the problem is without any regulation, without any framework, there's no price to pollute. We're basically pricing it at zero, which means we're going to be polluting too much. So the goal is how can we find the correct, efficient price that is hopefully politically possible, right? And then this is one way to go about it, right? But again, consumers and producers are not going to love this because it's still raising their cost of production, right? Which means supply is going to shift to the left, higher prices for consumers, lower prices that producers get, right? Heavy polluters are definitely not going to like this, especially if they can't find easier, cheap ways to change their production. And also, this might not be a great method because if you go into a recession, demand can fall, causing the price of the permits to fall. In my class, we did an example of this in Europe, how their trading scheme didn't really end up working very well. The price of a ton went from $30 to $5 because there was so much political pushing to increase the supply of permits that the price fell way below where it should be, and it sort of made the whole thing a mess, right? But when you think about things we could do, this is one thing we could do, all right? Here's the advantages and disadvantages, all right? Then what else we can do? Regulation, right? Generally, economists like taxes better than regulation, right? The reason for that is because we like putting the pressure on a business and saying, figure it out however you can, right? We're just trying to discourage this activity, but great, as long as you pay us, everything's good. Regulations often dictate the way that companies need to operate. So companies lose the discretion upon how to operate, right? And the government doesn't collect any revenue from doing this, and it costs money to monitor it. But the idea is we're shifting supply to the left because what regulation does is it increases the cost of production, right? So now businesses need to conform to these new regulations, and they might not be able to use the lowest cost of production methods available. For instance, my example before about the dry cleaner dumping toxic materials down the sewer, right? That was the lowest cost of production. If we tell them to stop doing that, well, the second lowest cost of production is a higher cost of production. And so it's going to shift their supply to the left. And then we're going to have to monitor it. We're going to have enforcement of it. There's going to have to be some penalty, right? Otherwise, they're not going to do it. And so getting all of this right tends to be a little difficult, but this is one possibility of what we could do for negative externalities, right? So here, if we did that, then we would shift supply to the left, all right? Again, negative externalities are either overproduced or overconsumed, and we need to get the quantity to be reduced, right? Great. All right. Give me 10 seconds, read the next couple slides, then I'll jump back. All right. So before we get into positive externalities, let me address one of the questions. So when something is elastic, raising the price causes people to not want the product. All right. So let's be very careful with our wording. So when the demand is elastic, what that means is a 1% increase in price will reduce quantity demanded by more than 1%, right? That's it. But we need to be very specific. So we don't want to say things like don't want the product, because that makes it seem like quantity is going to zero, right? And that's not happening unless it's perfectly elastic, which means a horizontal demand curve, which is basically not happening, right? So as long as it's downward sloping, when we increase the price, quantity demanded will fall by a greater percentage. And yeah, that's how we want to say it, and total revenue will fall. And I'm not sure about the second question. All right. So now back to positive externalities. All right. So a good one to know is education. All right. But before we get into that, know the difference between consumption and production. Production is by making something, right? There are spillovers. Consumption is by using it, by consuming it, there are spillovers, right? So before the dry cleaning, in the production of dry cleaning, there were spillovers, right? Negative externalities of production. Here, it's not through the building of colleges that we have positive spillovers. It's through people learning in those buildings. It's through consuming education that we have those spillovers. So here, you would definitely want to explain what those external benefits are, right? So for education, it's things like lower propensity to commit crime, more likely to pay higher taxes, to earn higher incomes that pay those higher taxes, anything that spills over to other people, all right? If you said just earn a higher income, you'd be wrong, because that's a private benefit, not an external benefit, right? That's why people decide for themselves to go to college, but that's not an external benefit for society that's not being factored, right? So education is a merit good, right? So a merit good means that it's being underproduced. Basically, it means that it's a positive externality as opposed to a demerit good, which is a negative externality, right? And so here we have our private benefit and we have our private cost. And so that is going to be our quantity free market or quantity equilibrium. But we have an MSB, a marginal social benefit, that is greater than the private benefit because of these external benefits. And again, you should label the graph, the distance between those two lines, as external benefits. All right? So this means we are under consuming the good. The reason we are under consuming the good is because we are not factoring in the external benefits that society gets by going to college. Right? So here, potential welfare gain, you could call it deadweight loss, either way, perfectly fine with me, right? Because both ways are saying inefficiency, right? It's inefficient because at the free market quantity, MSB is greater than MSC. MSB being greater than MSC means we are under consuming the good, right? We have too little of the good. So that's the issue here. So what could we do? Well, we could do corrective subsidies. We could subsidize the colleges. That would shift supply to the right, lowering the price for consumers and getting the quantity correct, right? Or closer to where it is correct. Right? That would mean that the deadweight loss would either shrink or hopefully go away entirely, right? That's one thing we could do. The downside to corrective subsidies is money, right? The opportunity cost. That's going to cost the government money, right? We could give the subsidies to consumers, but I mean, great, that's going to shift demand to the right. That's going to make quantity right. It's still going to cost money. And anyone that doesn't get a subsidy is then going to have to pay higher prices, right? Because the price will get bid up. Government provision, this is an example of K through 12 education, where instead of subsidizing private institutions, the government can come in and provide it themselves, right? So that basically be like an increase in size of the market, supply would shift to the right, and quantity would get closer to where it needs to be. And lastly is positive advertising, right? So this could increase the demand. Again, we only care about getting the quantity right. The downside to this is it takes a while and it costs government money. So again, there might be like several different things that we can do that might be right? But you should have like the pros and cons and then have an idea of like what your conclusion is, what works best. And then here are the graphs of how we would show it. And so I didn't go over productive positive externality because, well, the IB literally has never tested it. I believe will never test it. So I'm skipping that one. All right. And then here is the market for education. Oh, and that's it, right? So if you guys want, send me an email with any questions, right? I'll hang around for a couple minutes, answer whatever you guys need, and then that's it, all right? So take 2 minutes, send me some questions. Otherwise, this was great, and I will try to archive this so that everyone else can see it, all right? Thank you guys for coming. All right, so I'm just going to answer questions as they come in. So one said, outside of externalities, is demand MSB or MPB? So that's a good question. So you can either, I really don't want to confuse you, but the way that I put it as MSC and MSB is totally correct, and you will get full credit. If you just for things like price floors, price ceilings, things like that. If you want to show why there's a deadweight loss, if you just stick to MSC and MSB, you'll be fine. But sure, you could also just do marginal cost and marginal benefit. All right. The reason why I do MSC and MSB is because that it's an easier transition to when we did externalities. Right. So that's why I didn't go the MSC route, but literally either of those two will be right. Don't write MPB, that's not right. All right, so stick to either MCMB or MSC, MSC. Yes, you are watching me on the TV. All right, the review sheets, again, are not mandatory, right? So the review sheets were there to help you. You don't have to do them, but if you do them and you go through the checklist, you'll be in great shape. If anyone was missing a homework, then a review sheet would substitute for the missing homework. All right. Pretty much all of the review sheets you should be able to fill out from the PowerPoints and from the textbook. All right. What I really like about the review sheets is like it really takes you through it step by step, helping you think about it logically, and it makes you remember real world situations. You do not want to be thinking during the test. You don't have enough time to think, right? You need to already have a template in your head about what you're going to write for any different type of question, and then during the test, just write it, right? What's good about these types of tests are there aren't that many templates, right? There aren't that many different types of questions they can ask you. So, like in that sense, it's easy enough to sort of memorize or remember certain things. All right. So if I were you guys, obviously get enough sleep. Sleep's always a good thing. Definitely go back over. Let me just make a quick list. If you guys want a list of what you should go over again, go back over non-price determinants of demand. What are the shifters of demand? Right? What are the non-price determinants of supply? So what are the shifters of supply? Consumer and producer surplus, what they are, what they mean, why they're important. With that, allocative efficiency. Splat, which is the determinants for elasticity. The PED graphs, so when should it be flat, when should it be steep, right? Also taxes and subsidies. So don't just know the graphs, have examples, and be able to tell me stakeholders, who are the winners, who are the losers, why is the government doing this, right? And again, make sure for taxes and subsidies, when we tax, when we subsidize, there should be now 2 new prices, one for the producer, one for the consumer. That's really important. I think a lot of people are getting that wrong on the graphs. Price floors, price ceilings, examples, why the government is doing it, and alternatives the government could do instead, right? Merit versus demerit goods, right? So positive versus negative externalities, how do we fix them? All of the externality graphs, make sure you know MSC, MSB, MPC, MPB, external costs and benefits, and where to find the deadweight loss, right? If you know that, you'll be great. All right, so somebody asked me, what are the determinants of PES? So there are 4 of them, but like I said earlier, you'll be fine for tomorrow, and in general, usually, if you just know time. So time is the most important determinant of supply. The more time we have means the more time we have to adjust, which means the supply curve gets flatter, right? So if you knew one determinant of supply, it should be time. And again, when it comes to things like price floors and price ceilings, the curves becoming flatter over time, exacerbating things like unemployment or a shortage for rent control. All right. Thank you guys so much, and good luck tomorrow.